I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know the discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello, and welcome back for another episode of I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher, and for this episode, hey, I'm happy to have another friend of mine in from the department, John. So let's just take a minute. We're going to let John kind of introduce himself and explain what he had done before he retired from police work.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to be a part of this with you. So I served about 27 years on the police department. I actually served with Kevin, and I actually recognize some elements of truth in the stories that he tells. I was a patrol officer for a number of years, and then I went to detectives, where I was investigating robberies and homicides. Eventually, I got promoted to sergeant, and I finished out my career as a motor officer / sergeant doing special events.
So 27?
Just shy of 27, yeah.
That's even more than I had remembered. And the other funny tie that we've got here is John, after I did episode number 3, which was Dirty Bathwater, which was probably just one of the nastiest dead body cases that I had to go on as a patrol officer, I later found out that John was actually the lead detective on that, and that was your first dead body?
That was my first case in the homicide unit, and the older veteran detectives, Tom and Larry, thought it'd be really great to have the new rookie homicide detective take this particular case, and so they kind of threw me into it with all that they had and watched me flounder and work my way through it. But it worked out.
Well, of course, because you have no choice.
Exactly.
So John, right after that had happened, and he found out that the episode came out, and he had done it. He sent me a couple of pics, and I will tell you, those brought back some nasty memories. And then the other thing was John brought up some other details that I had forgotten about with regard to the condition of the inside of the apartment, which was not pleasant. Anyway, and then just on talking, before we started to record, I found out that you also were lead dick on the episode 10 that I just did, which was the really bad traffic vehicle accident, officer-involved shooting, is correct, right?
That's correct. And it's kind of funny because in that episode you were talking about juggling all these different situations, and that was actually my second shooting of the night. I'd been called out from home for a shooting on the south side of town, and then this incident came out, and there was nobody else available apparently because I had to leave what I was doing on the south side and go up to investigate this. And I went to the scene of the shooting, and then I ultimately ended up at the crash site. And I spent about 10 years of my career in the traffic bureau investigating traffic accidents, and I'm with you. That was probably the most horrific collision I'd ever seen.
Which, I mean, again, I did no traffic. I had no desire to ever do that. But, coming from you, having that much time in there and kind of reaffirming what I believe, that was a bad one. That was a really bad one. What was the shooting down south? Was that also an officer involved, or was it?
No, it was a fight at a bar.
Oh, okay.
And it had spilled out into the alleyway behind the bar, and there was a shooting.
Gotcha. Okay. But, another great example of how we are called upon to split multiple ways and have multiple things going at the same time that they all have to be addressed and just deal what you can.
It was a juggling match for sure, trying to keep everything all balanced. And
sure.
Not quite sure how I was the only detective available at the time, but apparently that was the case.
They must have had a party that you were invited to.
Well, that usually happened too.
And then the last thing that I do want to bring up with John, and I wasn't sure he was even going to remember, but way back when I was brand new, I was off duty and driving my vehicle, and unfortunately had a vehicle collision. I still am not sure. I was distracted. It's a long story, but poor John shows up on his motor, and he comes up and does what all motors do. He recognizes me and kind of thinks, oh, hey, go ahead. I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I come rolling up, and I see Kevin standing there. I'm like, cool, I've got a good witness. I'm going to, I'm going to know what happened in this collision. So I'm like, Kevin, did you see what happened? And he's like, yeah, I'm vehicle 1. And vehicle 1 is reference to the person who generally, I don't want to say causes the collision, but they're the ones that walk away with the ticket from the collision. And then he explained to me that something had caught his attention, and he had ultimately run into the back of a BMW and shoved it all up into the side of the road, up into the grass. And now I'm faced with, I'm going to have to write Kevin a ticket. I really like Kevin. He's my friend. I feel terrible about doing this. And he could see the inner turmoil in my head as I'm trying to figure out, what am I going to do here? And he finally just said, it's okay. Write me the ticket.
And if you knew John and if you knew how motors work, you would sometimes question if they really have friends and family when they're out there doing those jobs and doing their wrecks and writing their tickets. And so I remember it because, they're so businesslike and they're so by the book. And it's such an odd dynamic to watch one of those guys showing you compassion and like trying to bend over backwards to say, God, I really wish I could do something else. And then finally you're just like, John, I get it,
That's an unfair statement. I think I have compassion.
I think if we really looked into it, I could come up with numerous stories. We could talk about people citing their relatives. That's a whole other episode, though, John. That whole traffic motor thing is a whole other episode. So what are you doing now, John?
So I retired from the police department in January of 2012, and I had always had an interest in real estate and becoming a realtor. So once I retired, I went to real estate school, and I've been a licensed full-time realtor since about July of 2012, just helping people buy and sell and invest in real estate and helping them along the way.
So what areas do you primarily work here in Phoenix?
So my office is based in Queen Creek, and I typically work Queen Creek, Chandler, Gilbert. I go wherever the business is. I kind of try to target my target market is probably first responders because I get them and I understand them.
Sure.
And sometimes I think as first responders, we're not, especially police officers, we're not entirely trusting of other people.
Very
and
true.
So I think that if I can connect with somebody and let them know that I'm one of them, then I think we can establish a good relationship there. And I love helping them work through the process of buying and selling homes.
Sure. So if somebody wants to contact you, what's the best way to reach out and get a hold of you?
You can call me. My number is 480-458-7399. Or you can visit me on the web at www.eastvalleyproperties, all one word, .net.
How about any social media stuff?
Facebook is East Valley Properties. And Twitter is JP Farron. Yeah.
Twitter? You Twitter?
I tweet every now and again.
Lord. Did not know about that.
I even have an Instagram. That's a JP Farron Realtor. I probably use that a little bit more than Twitter, but Facebook and let's not forget YouTube also.
Oh, that's right, your videos. Well, so a number of ways people can get a hold of you if they want to for some help.
All sorts of ways, and for the first responders out there, I had your back on the streets, and I'll continue to have your back now as you buy and sell real estate.
Nice, John. I'm glad to hear it. I'm happy to put out the information for you as well.
Thank you. Appreciate
highly recommended.
The commercial there.
Oh, of course. Well, so hey, I want to get into what we're here for, and this is a really interesting story, and I have to be honest, I don't recall a ton of information on this. So when John and I had initially discussed this episode, it was really appealing to me, not only from interest in the listeners, but also from interest in myself, because it was a pretty neat case. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get going with tonight's episode, which is Death of a Salesman. So John, like I said, I'm going to rely on you quite a bit to give the majority of this episode's information. So let's just start from the very beginning. I'll just kind of let you go from there.
So I don't remember the episode or the incident either, so we're just going to make it up as we go. So this case involved lots of different elements involving sex, drugs, money. It had everything that makes for a juicy novel, I think, except for the fact that it's real people and real death. would make for a pretty good movie, I think. So the basic premise of what happened is, if you were in Phoenix in the late 90s and early 2000s and you watched any TV at all, you saw TV commercials for Empire Auto Glass. And Rick Chance was the owner and spokesperson for Empire Auto Glass. His shtick was, if you buy a windshield with him, he'll give you 12 free dinners to various different restaurants, whoever he had a contract with at the time. So
I remember.
It was, "Hi, I'm Rick Chance with Empire Auto Glass, and if you buy a windshield from me, I'll give you 12 free dinners to El Paso Steakhouse."
Yep.
Well, Rick was extremely well known. His commercials aired all the time. But what a lot of people didn't know is he also had a side business where he had started designing his own line of jewelry and was selling jewelry. I'm not quite sure where you want to go with this. This is going to get edited out, right?
You never know. You never know.
So let's start with the event itself, and then I'll go back and kind of maybe fill in some of the gaps.
Sure.
So on the morning of August 9th in 2002, a maid went into a hotel room in Tempe to clean it, and upon entering, she found a dead body in the room, laying in a pool of blood. The police were contacted, patrol responded out to the scene, and determined that this was not a natural death, and requested that detectives respond. So the first detective to arrive at the scene, Tom, who's been referenced in other episodes, quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide. And I think the biggest clue is the fact that there was a gunshot wound and a spent shell casing and no gun found in the room. So that initiated a call for the rest of the homicide unit to respond. That's how I got involved with this case.
John, let me interrupt you just for a second. So just so people understand, it's like these guys aren't constantly running to these homicide scenes. So give me an idea. So before this call kicked out, what are you doing during the rest of your morning? Like, what had you started to do with regard to anything else?
So this day, I had actually been at training all day long at the National Guard Armory in Phoenix. And it was probably about 5 p.m., and I was on my way home when my pager went off. That kind of dates us a little bit there. And I returned the page, and that's when I learned that they were working a possible homicide scene at this hotel. And the detective sergeant, don't remember who it was I talked to at the time, asked that I respond to the scene to help out with the investigation. And so that's what happened. And when I got to the hotel room, there were probably 3 or 4 other detectives that were already there, and we all just started kind of coordinating how we were going to approach this investigation.
So what is something like that? So give me an idea. Say that there's 3 or 4 of you and you kind of have your powwow. What would be kind of the base of the conversation?
Well, you're gonna assign somebody to be in charge of the crime scene, and then you're going to have somebody else who, in this particular case, we had determined that we probably had some video of Rick checking into the hotel, so somebody else was working on that aspect. His vehicle was out in the parking lot and needed to be secured and have a search warrant issued for that. So we just kind of started divvying out all the different aspects of the investigation. But before we got to that point, we didn't know who this person was in the room. And I remember I had his wallet, and I opened it up and was looking at his driver's license, and it said Charles Richard Chance. And that didn't mean anything to me.
Right.
I mean, I remember even in my mind going, Chuck Chance, Charlie Chance, seeing if anything wrong. Nothing.
Right.
Then I started going through the wallet and found Empire Auto Glass, Rick Chance, and that's when it hit me, because everybody knows Rick Chance.
Right.
And so that's when I'm like, hey guys, this is going to be a big one that's going to attract a lot of attention. And then I told the other detectives who our victim really was. Turns out Rick had already been entered into the computer system as a missing person out of Paradise Valley. He was scheduled that morning to shoot another series of commercials for his windshield business, and he failed to show up for the TV commercial shoot. And based upon some conversations and things that had been happening over the days leading up to this, his business associates decided to file a missing person report with the Paradise Valley Police Department.
Got it. So in a case like this where you have a high-profile person, give me some of the issues that they may cause for you or some of the difficulties that that adds to the problem.
So there's going to be, in this case, I knew there was going to be a ton of media presence on this. And with every homicide case, every case is important. But the ones that attract a higher level of media presence also attract a higher level of administration scrutiny and pressure. And I can remember being in the parking garage of the PD at some point during the early stages of this investigation, talking to my wife on the phone saying, I don't know if I can do this because there is going to be so much pressure on us to get this done. And she kind of had to talk me off the ledge a little bit there. It was interesting that the mantle of responsibility that I was feeling on my shoulders at the time.
Sure.
We had, in the first 2 weeks of this investigation, I had over 90 hours of overtime.
Wow.
So I worked my 80 hours plus another 90 hours of overtime in the first 2 weeks trying to figure out who had done this and where they were and solving this case.
Yeah, and understand, guys, that when people get into a massive and major investigation like this, what John just described with the amount of hours that are dedicated to it, that's not uncommon. And if this had not been a high-profile case, I would venture to guess that the hours themselves probably would have been about the same. Just like John said, homicide's a homicide. We put the same amount of time into it, but those high-profile cases definitely they're problematic. They add things that you normally wouldn't have to deal with regards to media attention and some of the other things that go on. But it is, I can't restate the fact enough that sometimes the pager goes off and the next thing you know, you're launched into working more hours in a week that you literally could work in a month.
Well, you watch the TV shows and the detectives arrive on scene and they bark out a few orders and point to some people and say, bag that, tag that, and then they're off. And within 42 minutes, if you subtract out all the commercials, they've got the bad guy in custody.
That's right.
And in a lot of cases, they've already been to trial and convicted him. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people who don't have the opportunity to see law enforcement up close and personal, that's how they believe things happen.
Right.
And that's about as far from the truth as can be.
Yeah. Well, it's a preconditioning. We talk about going to court and the issues with trying to prove things in court. Sometimes the juries are looking for all of that slam dunk evidence that they've seen so many times from TV and movies.
I think the biggest thing that has really affected that is the CSI TV shows.
Yes.
Because CSI uses concepts that are legitimate, but the time frames and the way in which they're used aren't, because it doesn't make for good TV.
Well, of course
But
not.
the general public expects us to be able to come in with a chemical called luminol and spray it around, and all of a sudden we've got DNA and we know who our suspect is, and it's all done in 20 minutes, and that's just not the case.
Right, which obviously, and as we continue, obviously you'll see where a lot of this work, it takes you in different directions, and sometimes it takes you in a dead-end direction. You have to start over from point A. Anyway, so we've you find the body, you identify who it is, you definitely let people know that, hey, it's high profile, we're going to have some issues with, again, the admin side of it I completely get as well. So where do things go from there?
So as I had said earlier, we had a detective who went to review the front desk video to see when Rick checked in and if anybody was with him. And from the previous evening, we found video where Rick was checking into the hotel and there was a younger Asian girl at his side as he was checking in. That really became important to us because we don't know who she is. We certainly don't have her now, and Rick is dead. So kind of our first goal at that time was to get her identified. That was a difficult process in and of itself because we have a grainy video, and we need to try to figure out who this person is. Ultimately, the video was shown on the news, and we immediately started getting phone calls of people telling us that they recognized the girl and giving us her name. And the best witness to this that called us in said, "I know who that person is because that's my daughter."
Oh, wow.
And so we were able to meet with the mom, and the mom obviously identified the girl in the video and told us who she was.
Wow. So let's look at, you talk about posting that information on the news. What goes into a decision like that, whether or not because a lot of times you hear these cases where they say that we have information, we're just not going to disclose, or, it comes that point in time where you decide you're going to. So what kind of goes into that thought process?
So we didn't immediately go to the press with the information. We probably held it back for about 24 hours as we were trying other investigative techniques. The thing with going to the press is it does give you a lot of exposure and people will come forward, but it also kind of tips our hand to the suspect that we're onto them.
Yeah.
And you lose kind of the element of surprise, and you also lose the ability to follow up on them because now they know that you're coming. You know what I mean? So
absolutely.
So we probably held out for 24 hours or so before we went to the media with the video.
So would it be fair to say that we'll typically try to develop things on our own prior to making that release?
Right. And one of the reasons in this case that we held out was we knew that Rick was divorced, 2 or 3 times divorced, and he was single at the time, and he'd been on several dating sites. And we knew that he had some sort of contact with an Asian female, and that they may have been on a date or two. And this was, even though the video wasn't great, we could tell this was an Asian female in the video. So we were doing some computer forensic type work on his computer and identified an Asian female with whom he'd been in contact with. So our investigation initially that first night took us to locating that person to determine if they were in fact involved in this or not. And as it turned out, they weren't. They had nothing to do with it.
Got it. So we air it on TV. Mom actually is the one that calls and gives you the most solid, hey, I know who this person is. And so you speak with Mom, and kind of where's it go from there?
So Mom told us that her daughter, Brandy, had a boyfriend named Robert, and she couldn't really remember the last name. She kind of guessed at it as being Lemick or something to that effect. But she told us that they were currently staying at an apartment complex and kind of gave us a vague description. She didn't know the address, but she gave us the general area of town that the apartment complex was in. So we sent a detective to that apartment complex, and she was able to go into the office and meet with the manager. And as it turns out, Robert Lemke was one of the names on one of the leases in the apartment. And so we were able to then determine that Robert Lemke was Brandy Hungerford's boyfriend. So at least now we had a location where they may not be there right now, but they had been staying there.
So at that point, how are you feeling as a case lead? You're getting all this information in there. I mean, what's your mind telling you? Are you feeling confident that this is going to be your folks? Are you still kind of holding back that, just not sure?
We located a vehicle. So once we had Robert identified, or at least we had an idea of who he was, we knew what kind of car he was driving, and we found that car actually in the parking lot of the apartment complex. So we got a search warrant for the apartment, and I don't know if you were there or not. It was guys from your unit that were going to serve this search warrant for us. I remember one of the guys, Bob, kicking in the door. For whatever reason, we didn't have a key. I don't know why. But I just remember Bob kicking in that door, and it took him several attempts, and he was getting a little frustrated. But during the search of this apartment, we found jewelry tags that we were able to link back to Rick. Now, we knew, I should probably back up a little bit. in talking to Rick's business partners, we knew that he had gone that evening, the prior evening, to meet somebody, and he had what they believed was about $1 million worth of jewelry in a duffel bag. And the assumption was that he was meeting them to show one of their friends some jewelry, so that the friend was getting married and was going to buy something from him. So in watching the videotape of him checking in, we could see him walking into the hotel with a duffel bag in his hand. But during the search of the hotel room, during the investigation, that bag was nowhere to be found. So it was quite apparent to us that the jewelry had been taken.
Sure.
So when we did the search warrant in the apartment, in the trash can, we found tags that we were able to definitively show belonged to Rick and his jewelry. So we knew we were on the right path.
Right. So, and he was not there at the time, right? That you served the warrant on the apartment?
Correct. Nobody was there.
Gotcha. Okay. So where did it go from there?
We started doing some background on Robert Lemke, and we learned that he was from Tacoma, Washington. We learned that he had a violent background, and we actually started to become concerned for Brandy because we didn't know Brandy's actual involvement in the case, and we didn't know where they were, and so there was some concern that Brandy might actually be in danger, and we needed to find them fast. There were probably 25 detectives throughout this case assigned to it, working all sorts of different angles. One detective flew to Kansas to interview some acquaintances of Robert.
I remember that.
Yeah, and I'll just pause for a second here and tell you that this investigation was probably the absolute best example of teamwork and working together to achieve a common goal as I had ever seen. As the lead detective in the case, I was just honored and thrilled to be working with this caliber of people who were pouring so much into this investigation to ultimately have a great outcome at the end. It was pretty awesome. So we had people all over the place, and during these various interviews and whatnot, we learned that Robert was staying at a hotel in Tacoma, Washington.
So I want to back up a little bit because you talk about all these detectives that come out to help you. And again, just so people understand, so these folks aren't just sitting at their desk waiting for someone to call and say, hey, gosh, I could really use some help. Where are these other people coming from, and what are they giving up to essentially come and help you with yours?
Well, like I said earlier, it was about 5 p.m. when I got the call. So as this investigation starts to unfold, the deeper into the night we get, the more help we need. So we start calling out detectives from home, and it's detectives who are working in their normal course of business is other types of crimes, property crimes, domestic violence, check fraud, whatever. And we were pulling from the resources that we had, but pretty much everybody was coming out from home in the middle of the night and then working until we would work until we just couldn't work anymore, and we'd go home and catch about 4 hours sleep, and we'd come right back in and get right back at it again.
Right. So we have the interest and the concern about Brandy and her safety. What kind of background did she have, or had you figured any of that out yet at that point?
So Brandy, we knew, was a dancer at a couple of different strip clubs in Phoenix, and before we zeroed in on the actual apartment that they were staying at, we actually had a couple of previous addresses that Brandy had stayed at. She was living the lifestyle where she didn't particularly stay in one area for very long. She kind of bounced around. Mm-hmm. And so it became really important that we had detectives go to her previous addresses, but also go to where she worked. And it's really interesting that, I think if she had been an office assistant in an accounting office, it might have been difficult to get people to volunteer to go. But being that she was a dancer at a couple of strip clubs, there were plenty of volunteers who were going to go do the follow-up and see if they could locate Brandy at work.
Sounds familiar. Very familiar.
I believe you covered that in another episode.
I did. Yep. I totally see the logic in that. So.
Yep. So Brandy was a dancer. She was adopted. She was Korean, and an American family had adopted her. And that's really about all we knew, is that she was a dancer and she just bounced from place to place.
Any criminal background?
I don't recall that she had any criminal background.
Okay.
Nothing she'd been caught for anyway.
Good point. So we're worried about Brandy a little bit. We're definitely homed in on Robert. And where is it going from there?
So we learned... So Robert was at a hotel in Tacoma, Washington, and he had actually called a friend in Cave Creek. And that friend told us that she had received a phone call from Robert and where he was. So we immediately notified the Tacoma Police Department up in Washington, told them what our investigation was and who we were looking for. By the time they went to the hotel, Robert had already checked out. But they pulled surveillance video, and it was clear that Robert and Brandy and some of Robert's friends from Washington had checked into this hotel. So we knew Brandy was safe, at least up to this point, because we had her on video in the lobby of the hotel with Robert, and they were with a group of people that we later determined were friends of Robert's from the area. But they were gone from the hotel. We were able to determine, I think through the same person that told us about the hotel, gave us a name of one of Robert's good friends where he would stay when he'd go back to Tacoma. Robert, we didn't know at the time, but we learned, was actually running marijuana from Washington down to Phoenix and distributing it. And every time he would go to Tacoma, he would stay with this particular friend named Brad. So we were able to get Brad identified, and we learned his address. And so the following day, a couple of detectives from the Tacoma PD homicide unit went to kind of just scope out Brad's apartment complex, see if he still lived there, and see what they could find. As they were there getting ready to go in and talk to the management, they actually saw somebody who fit Robert's description with another guy walking through the parking garage and get into a car. Now, Robert was he was a large guy, muscular, well-built, kind of stood out in the crowd. Mm-hmm. So they were pretty confident that this guy they saw was Robert, plus we'd supplied them with pictures. The car pulled out of the parking lot, so they started following the car, and it was in the downtown Tacoma area. They got some patrol units to assist them, and they did a traffic stop on the car in Tacoma. They called the people out of the car, and they had Robert. He was on his knees with his hands in the air, and they were going up to handcuff him. And just as they got to him, he sprang up and started to run. Well, Robert, he's a freight train. Once you get him moving, he's probably pretty hard to stop, but it takes a while to get moving. So he didn't make it very far before these detectives were on top of him and had him in custody in the middle of the street. And his booking photo even has a little scratch on his forehead that somehow or other happened during this altercation in the street.
Right. You run, you pay.
Yep. So now we had Robert in custody, and we had to find Brandy. So Tacoma PD officers went back to the apartment where Robert had been, and Brandy was actually in the apartment, and so we had both of them in hand.
So let me back up a little bit on a couple things. So how difficult or how easy would you say it is when you need to involve the help or the assistance of an outside agency, particularly if we're not just banging around in the Metro Phoenix area, you're going out of state and calling these folks. How does that work?
So the potential for it to be really difficult is pretty high. But in this case, the Tacoma Police Department, and particularly two of their homicide detectives, were just fantastic. Brian and Ed were their names, and they actually became good friends of ours. But we gave them the information, and they were on it. And anything we needed, they were willing to do. ultimately, once they had Brandy and Robert in custody, 4 of us hopped a flight and went to Tacoma to continue our investigation. And the entire detective bureau of the Tacoma PD just bent over backwards to help us out. So it worked out great. It's not always how it happens, but in this case, it worked out great.
Right. And so, the understanding is that we only have the powers of arrest and authority within the state that we are employed.
Correct.
So Arizona. So whenever we have, and I had the same thing happen with a case in Nevada, if we have something that rolls across the state line, we technically don't have the authority, or, we wouldn't even really know where we're going, what we're doing. Again, that's why you involve the guys that are local.
Right.
So we reach out to those guys. So it's, it's twofold. It's, for one, they have familiarity with the area and they know how things work. But 2, it's the legal side of things.
Exactly.
We are not authorized to do the things in Arizona or in that state that we can do in Arizona.
So Robert, we couldn't definitively say, we didn't have enough evidence yet to actually charge Robert in the robbery and the murder, but he did have an outstanding warrant in the state of Washington. And he just happened to be in the state of Washington with Washington cops. So that's what they initially hooked him up on was the warrant. Through our subsequent investigation there, we served several search warrants. But like you just alluded to, I can't go to Washington and write a search warrant. So in collaboration with the Washington detectives and kind of telling them where our investigation had led us thus far, they then wrote the warrants and went to their judges and got the search warrants, and then they were present with us and assisted us in the search warrants that we were able to serve.
Right. And, and John and a lot of the work that he did is very similar to a lot of the work I did involving search warrants. And search warrants, I think on their face, sound very scary, especially if you're a new cop and you're writing your first search warrant. But really, all a search warrant is we tell a story and explain why we need to go get something from somewhere, get somebody out of somewhere, obtain a certain item for a case, and then the judge essentially reviews and says, yes, go do that.
Right.
So it's really fairly simple, but they can get really convoluted, complicated, and then like John said, he can't go to Washington and do that. So John's got to basically tell his tale of woe to this detective who translates that into their jurisdictional paperwork of a search warrant, and then he goes to the judge. And, it's not like it's unheard of and it never happens, but it is rare that, a judge has presented a search warrant that's a little convoluted that occurred from another state and on and on and on. So it's very interesting, though, from the perspective of being a detective.
I think if you are clear and concise in what it is you're looking for and why you're looking for it, any reasonable person is going to say, well, yeah, duh, you need to go into that apartment and,
right,
and search it. So the judge is going to sign off on it if it's reasonable. And that's what we found. We searched an apartment, we searched a couple of cars, and we did find evidence that was able to link Robert and Brandy back to the murder.
Nice. I had another question for you. Now, when it came to, could you say that the majority of the good breaks that you got early on were the result of people giving you information?
Yeah. I don't want to take away from the hard work and the investigation that took place on the part of all the detectives involved.
Sure.
But without the assistance of Robert's circle of influence, I don't know that we would have been able to get him in custody as quickly as we did.
And part of the reason I ask this is because I want to quantify. So, again, having a totally different career path than John had, a lot of the interviews of, technically you call these people informants, but, snitches or whatever name you want to leave. When you're talking about the dope world, people are very reluctant, and it's rare that we would actually get people to give us good information. So cross-check that with a major investigation like this, where somebody's been killed. How would you say it's much different? Do you find that people are a little more forthcoming, or you get more information out of them in a bigger investigation?
I think you get more information because the stakes are higher.
Okay.
If you're working a dope case and your informant doesn't really tell you where Robbie is with the dope, Is the informant really going to pay any kind of a price on that? Probably not. These people, they are working in the underworld, but some of them still have some amount of conscience and morals and values. And now we're talking homicide.
Right.
And on whatever level they feel on that, they don't want to be involved. We had the father of Robert's child was very helpful in Kansas in helping us determine where he was. The friend that we contacted in Cave Creek was really helpful. And then there was a guy in Phoenix that was instrumental in us recovering the gun actually used in the caper. And none of these people are walking on the right side of the law.
Right.
But they saw in this instance that the right thing to do was to give up the information that they had.
Sure. That's exactly what I always suspected. And again, from working investigations and hearing how they go and bumping into the frustration of these people not giving us good information on a dope case, but then you hear about a case like that. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's exactly what it is. The stakes are so much higher.
Right.
You're talking about a loss of life versus dope or, tell me who robbed this bank. People, they're just not going to be nearly as forthcoming.
Right.
Interesting. So let's go back to Tacoma. They get a hold of Robert. They get a hold of the other folks. Where do things go from there?
Robert's taken into custody, and he invokes his rights under Miranda and chooses not to cooperate or speak with investigators. So there's no conversations with Robert at all.
So it's not like TV or the movies where you can go in there and, turn the camera off and lean on his chair and...
I don't know if you watch Blue Bloods, but we don't operate the way Danny Reagan operates. If only we could.
Yeah.
Actually, I take that back. It's best that we don't operate that way.
Right.
So Robert never wanted to talk, so there was never any conversations with Robert. Brandy, on the other hand, I think found herself much deeper into something than she ever thought she was going to get into, and she wanted a way out. And over a course of, I think it was 2 different interviews, she came clean and gave us all the information we needed.
So where did these interviews take place? Who was there? I mean, how did all that happen?
So it's funny. In the opening segment, you kind of talked about the non-caring motor cop and direct him to the point. And I do I recognize that in myself a little bit.
You resemble that remark?
I do resemble that. I'm working on it. I think I've lightened up a bit. So there were 4 detectives that flew up to Washington, and one of them was, I guess, probably could be called our lead homicide detective. The other one was a female homicide detective that we thought would probably be able to bond with Brandy on a better level than me or probably anybody else. So those 2 detectives, the female and the lead detective, they're the ones who actually interviewed Brandy, and it was the right decision to have them do it because they were able to establish a rapport with her and elicit information from her that I probably couldn't have been able to. Which
again, we could. If we really wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of this, we could probably talk about it for 3 hours. But I think it brings up a great point that not only are there 1,000 other things that these guys are worrying about, it comes down to determining who's the best person to talk to somebody else and why they're the best person and where we're going to do it and how the interview room is set up and what questions are asked. When you're talking about a major investigation like this, these guys have to think all of this stuff out. It's not like... today John and I come into the studio and we plop down in front of a couple of mics and we go, hey, let's just talk about this.
Right.
These guys have quarterbacked this thing out. They have planned their game strategy all the way through to the points of if they say this, we're going to say this. If they ask this, we're going to ask that. I mean, all the way through. So it's definitely not, they're just not walking into the room blank and saying, what happened?
And if they haven't quarterbacked it out, they need to be able to think on the fly and adapt to the person in such a manner that the person will open up and talk to them.
Exactly. I mean, it's very choreographed and it's very detailed. Again, not having that experience, but having experience with doing a number of what I'll just call them street interviews, where you're interviewing some guy in the side of your car, so much different than the planned out methodical approach that these guys have taken. And I remember a couple of homicide cases or the bigger felony charges where I would watch bits and pieces of interviews that detectives made with these guys when we'd been usually assigned to go find them. It always impressed me. I mean, it was always very impressive how methodical and smart these guys approach this stuff. Whereas, half the time I'd be willing to bang the desk and just go, well, F you, I'm done. Get out of here kind of thing.
Well, and that's why there's lots and lots of interview and interrogation schools. And you can do a roadside interview along the side of your car and get some information, but there are techniques that have to be learned and implemented. And once those techniques are learned and you start using them, it's amazing what you can get somebody to actually tell you and come clean on.
And the takeaway here, guys, is smarts and patience, of which I didn't have much of either. So that's why I went the directions I went. But it is very interesting to me, and it always has been. Now, I have another question. Do you feel, and I've always thought this, when you have a major case where something horrible has happened, a death like this, do you think that people truly want to get things off their chest? Do you think it's just a matter of time before people will finally talk to you? Again, there's going to be the exceptions. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think some do, but there are some really hardened people out there. I had another homicide case where it was a drug deal that went bad, and let's just say that we found the victim in various locations around the valley. And that suspect was the personification of evil himself. I don't think he wanted to get anything off his chest.
Yeah.
In Brandy's case, like I said, she was in over her head, and this was her first foray into the criminal world, and it went horribly wrong because the intention was never to kill Rick. It was a ripoff. It was supposed to be a robbery.
So let's no further ado. So what happened? What went down?
So Brandy had told Rick that she had some friends that were getting married and they wanted to see his jewelry, and that if he would go to this hotel with her and bring the jewelry, the friends would meet him there. They'd look at the jewelry, and then once the friends left, she and Rick would stay the night and party.
Well, how did he ever come to know her to begin with?
So Rick was advertising his jewelry in the newspaper. And, for those of you that probably aren't old enough to remember, we actually had newspapers that would come out and had an ad section. Rick was selling Rolex watches and his own custom jewelry, and he was placing ads in the newspaper. As kind of a side note to all of this, before this happened, Robert and Brandy had already targeted Rick as somebody they wanted to rip off. Brandy met Rick. They went on a couple of dates, and the plan was to get Rick back to his house in Paradise Valley, where Brandy would put something into his drink. He would get sleepy and pass out, and then Robert would come in, and they would take his jewelry and leave. Well, Robert's not the smartest tool in the box, and neither was Brandy. The plan was going great until Rick started getting tired, and he's like, yeah, I think you should probably go home, and made Brandy leave. Now, he didn't know her as Brandy. She was using a fake name, and she had a burner cell phone, so there was no real way to trace back who this person really was. Robert had gotten lost and couldn't find the house, so their plans were thwarted for that night. So then they came up with this bright idea of having the friend meet at the hotel, and so they used that ruse on Rick. Brandy was in the room with Rick, and she called Robert from the room and told them what room number they were in. She told Rick she was calling the friends.
Right.
And in reality, she was calling Robert and told what room number they were in. And then a few minutes later, she went out into the hallway, supposedly to get a drink from the vending machine. She waited at the vending machine for Robert to show up. She pointed at the door, and then Robert put on a ski mask and pulled out a gun and went into the room to rob Rick. Brandy heard a gunshot. She panicked. That was never part of the plan. And she went out the hotel out to the car. I guess she knew where Robert had parked, so she went to the car to wait for him. And a few minutes later, Robert showed up, and he had the duffel bag of jewelry with him.
So she left the room prior to all that occurring, and then after the gunshot, she never saw anything else, never went back in the room or anything, according to her.
Right, and there's no evidence that she was in the room. The plan was to rob Rick, and during the autopsy and subsequent investigation, even though Robert never talked to us, it was always our belief that Rick was sitting on the bed, and Robert came in and actually hit him over the head with the gun, and in the process of doing that had an accidental discharge, and that sent a bullet into Rick's back of his head and down his neck and into his chest cavity, and that's what killed him.
Wow. Which, again, folks, is another fallacy that no matter how many times you see on, I'm dating myself, but Hogan's Heroes or war stories or Army movies or cop shows, when we whack people on the head with the butt of our guns, it doesn't work that way. Typically, it just makes the person hurt and gashes their head open, and then the fight is on. It just doesn't work that way.
The only way for it to really work is to do what Robert did, and have an accidental discharge, and
then it's permanent,
and kill the guy, and that was certainly not part of their plan.
So you interview Brandy. She essentially tells you what you just reiterated, and what happens from there. You still have both of them up in Washington.
So they were both booked into the Pierce County jail system in Washington, where they were held while awaiting extradition back to Maricopa County. During that time period, investigation continued because there was still a lot of investigation to be done. One of the things we needed to do was recover the weapon. And Brandy had told us kind of the basic area. So according to Brandy, after the robbery, they went back to the hotel, they went through the jewelry, they grabbed their stuff, and they started heading for Tacoma. They made a stop in Cave Creek, and then they made a stop in Phoenix. And in Phoenix is where they offloaded the gun that they had used. And then they headed up to Tacoma, Washington. Brandy had told us that the gun had been given to a guy named Dan, and she didn't have an exact address, but she kind of had a pretty good location of where Dan's house was. And using the information that she provided, we're actually able to locate Dan. It was interesting because Robert was making phone calls from jail. And they know there's signs posted next to the phones and recordings. They know that the things that they're saying are being recorded. Well, Robert called a friend and said, "Tell Dan that he needs to get rid of the pizza box I gave him because the pizza's really going to start to stink." What does that mean?
Right.
Well, then we come to find out that he had put the gun in an old pizza box, gave the gun to Dan, and said, actually, I think Dan bought the gun, but Robert delivered it in a pizza box.
Got it.
So when you put that together and you're like, well, Robert's saying that pizza's going to stink and Dan needs to get rid of it, that kind of helped cinch the deal on Robert's involvement, because why else would he say anything like that?
Right.
And through some pretty crazy investigation and some real shady characters, we were able to recover the handgun and had it submitted for ballistic testing and determined that it was, in fact, the gun that had killed Rick.
So a very crucial piece of evidence to recover, though.
Yes.
Yeah. So, it's a pretty funny thing to think about how dumb these crooks can be. Just like John alluded to, you couldn't be more obvious about jail recording phone calls.
Right.
They basically hit these inmates over the head with it, but thank God they're not smart, because we get an awful lot of good information off of them.
I guess they figure it applies to everybody but themselves.
I get, or they're just too smart and they outsmart us with the pizza box
the
or
pizza
whatever
box,
lingo.
yeah, we weren't going to pick up on that one.
No, you'd never figure that out. So you recover the gun, and then what are some of the other things that happen post?
So Robert and Brandy were extradited back to Arizona. Through the investigation, we had learned that Robert, he was really into Rolex watches, and he had a friend who was blind who had Rolexes. And Robert went to this friend's house and brought another buddy along with him and took the friend's watches. And then when the friend came to realize his watches were missing, Robert blamed the guy that he brought along with him.
Classy.
So that the friend wouldn't suspect Robert.
Right.
And remember, this guy was blind, so he didn't see. He doesn't know. I tell that because that happened in Phoenix, and that case was filed along with our case. So when we went to trial on Robert, the jury, they were comfortable convicting him on possession of stolen property because we could put the jewelry in his possession, but they weren't comfortable convicting him of the murder, and they were hung on the murder charge. Huh. So the theft of the Rolexes from the friend, they convicted on that, and that sent Robert to prison for about 25 years, while more investigation was then conducted over the next couple of years, and there was a new trial. And Robert saw at that point that there was no way out, and he took a plea deal, and he's serving another 25 to life in prison, and that's where he's going to ultimately die probably.
Right. How about Brandy?
Brandy she testified against Robert. She was given a plea deal. She served 15 years, and she was released about 3 years ago. Huh.
Any idea what she's up to? Doing
No.
Nothing at all? You just know she's been released?
No, yeah, no idea.
Interesting. How about any contact or relationships with Rick Chance's family?
So during the course of the investigation, I got to know the family pretty well. Rick's mother passed away about a year ago. His brother Mike, I've stayed in pretty close contact with. He calls me from time to time when he has questions, and we're Facebook friends, and so we keep up on what each other's doing. And every August 9th, I'll reach out to him, and just kind of a memory of what had happened.
Interesting. So, you got to understand that I couldn't tell you any families or friends that I'm still in touch with from any of my investigations, but it goes to show you, I think there's a huge investment of your time and emotion and effort and on with these, these bigger investigations like homicide. I mean, someone's lost their life prematurely. It's a big deal to everybody.
It is, and it takes a toll on, obviously, the victim's family, but it leaves an indelible mark on the detectives involved in the case. I mean, I can think back to all the different homicide cases that I've been involved in, and I may not have a connection with the family members, but there are things about those cases that I remember that have left deep marks on me.
Yeah, they left a mark.
Yeah.
No doubt.
And one thing interesting about homicide cases is the victim's dead, but the evidence tells a story. And the victim, through the evidence, is telling their story. And it was always really gratifying to me to be able to bring whoever did that to justice. I know that sounds like a cliche, but to be able to give that family the closure and hold the person responsible, accountable. And that was a really good feeling of accomplishment and worthwhileness for me.
Nice. And another thing I will say, I know we're getting ready to close out, but in Tempe, we were very fortunate to have some of, quite frankly, the best investigators, I think, in the state with regard to the homicide side of things. I was fortunate to be parts and dipping in and out of a lot of those investigations just due to what we would help you guys with. And, would you agree? We had some really, really sharp folks.
There were a couple guys that I don't think anybody could hold a candle to them.
Yeah.
I certainly couldn't. It was cool to learn and grow with them. You mentioned that after the Rick Chance investigation, we got a commendation from Rick Romley, who was the county attorney at the time.
Yeah.
And he was expressing his gratitude for the exceptional investigation, and he just had nothing but praise for the way the investigation was handled and the outcome of it. And that was pretty cool to have the actual county attorney take notice in what we were doing and be pleased with our product.
Yeah. And, the last thing I'll say on that is the stuff that I used to do, we would bump against other agencies constantly, as well as county attorneys, prosecutors, et cetera, et cetera. And they always had such high remarks and regard for all of our detectives, really. The guy, basically the guys that they interacted with filing the cases. We always had really good feedback. It was nice. It was really nice to get that versus some of the other agencies that don't get such great feedback. So,
the guys, the boots on the ground were awesome to work with.
Yeah.
As you went up the chain, maybe things changed a little bit. I'm retired, I can say that.
That's right.
The last thing I'll throw out there, it's kind of ironic to me. We determined, so we were told that Rick had about $1 million worth of jewelry. It was probably closer to $500,000. When Robert got to Tacoma with the jewelry, he went to one of his buddies who's a fence and gave him the jewelry to go out and sell. Before that guy had the opportunity to make the sale, get rid of the jewelry, and get the money back to Robert, Robert was arrested and never saw the light of day since. So Robert's serving life in prison for a robbery and murder that he committed, where somebody else walked off with all the proceeds of it. The jewelry's never been found.
Oh, wow.
The guy's never been found. And Robert did the crime and paid the price, but this other guy, I don't know what he got for the jewelry, but he got some money out of it and no effort at all on his part.
Wow. And since Robert isn't talking, we'll probably never find out who that person was.
Well, we had a name. I actually had a couple of conversations with him on the phone.
Oh.
And we did track him to Lake Havasu City, where we went to contact him, and we never were quite able to develop enough information to make an arrest.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I believe he's the guy who got the jewelry, but I don't know where the jewelry is, and there's just never enough to actually arrest him on it. So right. he got away with Robert's murder.
Interesting. Wow. Well, ripple effect there, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, unless you have anything else to add, John, I think I'll probably wrap us up with that.
I think we've beat this one to
death. Pardon the pun.
I started to go there, and I thought I'm not going to. So, yeah, I think we've covered this one pretty well.
Well, I really appreciate you coming in. Really had a good time with it. I really enjoyed it and remembering the things that I'd forgotten and everything. And I kind of plan on, again, you got a lot of material. So along with some other folks, it'd be nice maybe to get you back in here again, and we'll have to do another one.
I'd love to come back and tell some more war stories with you.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, with that, hey, I'm going to close this episode of I Barely Got Here. I really appreciate you listening, and if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review, and ask your friends to give it a listen as well. If you have any questions or comments, you can shoot me an email at ibarelygodhere@gmail.com, and then you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And with that, Sam42
and Tom42
are 10-7.
Good night.